we have Dr. Ray Winbush, who is a longtime reparationist. He and I worked together for many, 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 many years. I think we met at that Tallahassee conference, Ray.
Boy, that was a million years
I
ago.
know, I know. And he's also the research director of research in urban studies. Did I get it right?
Well,
At Morgan
Director,
State.
Institute of Urban Research, yeah.
Okay, of the Institute of Urban Research at Morgan State. And he's written a book, on reparations that looks at uh, uh, various aspects of reparations, various, I'm blanking on the name of it, Ray, sorry.
Should America pay?
Should
America
America
pay.
Pay? I was gonna say the dead, I knew that wasn't you.
No,
But
that's
Should America
Randy.
Pay? And it was really good, but he's written other books as well. Next to him, I guess if it's next to him on my screen is Ronald Galvin. We call him Ronnie Galvin. He is the facilitator coordinator of the DC Coalition, Reparations Coalition. And we were just kind of talking about some of the initiatives in DC. Somebody just filed what is it, a ballot initiative for reparations, and it's along the lineage lines, $300,000, he said, to people who have ancestors who were enslaved in DC, I would assume. To Dr. Winbush, who will talk more generally about lineage. And then we'll go to Ronnie Galvin, who will talk about why, as the facilitator organizer of the DC Reparations Coalition, he basically insisted. I mean, he had, many of us agreed, but he was the lead voice in saying, we are not going to touch eligibility. Let the task force deal with eligibility. We're going to focus on other things. We're going to start the discussion with me sharing the position of William Darity Jr. and Kirsten Mullen, as taken from their book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, that was published in 2020, I'm sorry, as well as presented on various televised programs. There are 4 components to the Darity and Mullen's plan. 1, eligibility. Black Americans who have ancestors who were enslaved in the United States. 2, the legislation that is developed should ensure it plays the role of eliminating the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is the primary indicator of the cumulative effect of white supremacy. 3, direct payments should be made to the eligible recipients. 4, the reparations project should be conducted by the federal government. This is for 2 reasons. The federal government is the only level of government that has the capacity to meet the bill. It will cost in excess of $11 trillion to eliminate the wealth gap. The recent coronavirus pandemic shows the federal government can do it. It raised the money quickly and without increasing taxes. The second reason, the federal government is the culpable party. It bears the legal responsibility for the series of atrocities that Black Americans have been subjected to from slavery to the present moment. Darity and Mullins propose a plan for Black Americans who want to recover reparations to prove they are descendants of a person enslaved in the United States. It is outlined in the final chapter of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, again published in 2020. The federal government, in the process of establishing the Reparations Project, should provide resources to people trying to establish their DNA, support for their claims of descendancy from a person enslaved in the United States. Darity and Mullins suggests that the United States could create an agency that would do the research for those attempting to obtain reparations from the government. Why don't we start first? First, I want to welcome Shirley Traylor. Shirley Traylor, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the members of the Reparations Committee. She co-facilitates it with me. And so welcome, Shirley. And I don't think I introduced the students to the speakers, but I didn't introduce the speakers to the students. This is Dominique Cravens. Dominique is she's not even a student anymore. She just graduated. She's a recent law grad. And then that's April Hurley, who is a second-year student. Well, you start third year in the fall, right? April? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
She's a student at CUNY. Okay, so Ray, you want to take us to the discussion of lineage, maybe the more general, and then if you would like, maybe do a little critique. I have some questions to ask about Derities, but if you want to add some critique of what we just heard, that's fine. But we'd like to get a real good basis of what the other members of NCOBRA and other groups are saying in reparations eligible people who they should be.
Well, I actually wrote down my comments because I have kind of a visceral reaction when I listen to Darity because he's wrong at a variety of levels. First of all, I just want to start out by saying I'm going to read some of this. The idea of determining who is eligible for reparation is relatively new, having gained prominence in the mid-2010s. This concept encompasses two very different ideas. The first one is what you heard Darity talk about, and I've got this kind of summarized. It says the first idea is that reparations should only be allocated to descendants of enslaved Africans born in the United States and who can trace their ancestry back to slavery. That's what he said. Suppose as an individual has one parent, an individual has one parent who can trace their lineage to American enslavement and another from an immigrant background. In that case, they are still eligible for reparations unless the immigrant parent came to the United States after 1970. Very important. I mean, this is not my words. If you read the Foundational Black Americans, which is an offshoot of I guess it's offshoot of Yvette Carnell. It's almost impossible for me not to mention the names of some of these individuals. However, if the post-1970 immigrant parent has contributed to the upliftment of the American African community, these are their words, not mine, their children would be eligible for reparation. In other words, well, let me give you two people who wouldn't be eligible for reparations that we both know. You remember Abner Louima? Does anybody remember Abner? The students probably don't remember, but he was sodomized by the New York Police Department. He was from Haiti. And the other one was from Senegal by the name of Amadou Diallo, who was shot 41 times. Neither of them would definitely be eligible for reparations simply because of the fact that they had immigrated to this country and not met the criteria of the so-called foundational Black Americans. Now, who determines, the other person that wouldn't be eligible would be Kwame Ture, if he were still alive. Stokely Carmichael for some of the younger people. He wouldn't be eligible because both of his parents were Trinidadian. And regardless of what he contributed, he just wouldn't meet Darity's criteria. I could go on and on with that. The second idea of eligibility, which I ascribe to, is defined in broader terms, encompassing all American Africans who have been adversely affected by systematic racism and discrimination, regardless of their specific ancestry, nationality, or country of origin. if you read John Henry Clark, he talks about the fact that if you had two brothers, I'm talking about two blood brothers, who were picked up, let's say, on the coast of Ghana under the Portuguese, let's say in about 1750. One was dropped off in, uh, let's say, Jamaica, and the other one was dropped, and I'm talking about actual brothers. One was dropped off in Jamaica, and the other one was dropped off in, let's say, South Carolina. They have different nationalities, but their origins are African. So these proponents of harm-based reparations, which I think should be the only eligible criteria, um, argue that reparations should be based on the ongoing effects of past injustices, regardless of nationality, regardless of an individual group's direct historical connection to the harm. They argue that certain communities continue to suffer from the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and other forms of systematic oppression. And I have here as a snide remark, the first of the many logical absurdities of the so-called eligibility test for reparation is that no such criteria were applied to Africans when they were captured in Africa. The only eligibility requirement the Europeans had for enslaving us was the color of our skin. They didn't ask if we were Asante or Yoruba or Igbo or Mandinka or Shona. So far from honoring our ancestors who deserve reparations, we dishonor them by using European and American records that were often distorted, destroyed, and falsified to exonerate those who were enslaving Africans. When I was teaching at Fisk, we did a massive study, and you can still see it online. Somebody said it was the largest study that hasn't been replicated, torn from the land. We worked with the Associated Press, and we sent out, I forget, something like 400 to 500 announcements to Black newspapers throughout the United States and some white newspapers as well. And we asked people, tell us, about your land theft. And I've got a chapter about that in Should America Pay called And the Earth Moved. I was surprised. Well, I was working with Naomi Tutu, who worked with me at Fisk, Bishop Tutu's daughter, and we were surprised to see that a lot of people couldn't find the land that they once owned. I mean, actually owed the land simply because of the fact that courthouses were burned, records were destroyed at a variety of levels. And then, so Darity, and I'll kind of stop after this, Darity assumes that all these records are intact, that, Audrey, you can just walk down to where you were born, get all the stuff, and they'll say, thank you, can we help you further? And all of these records will be there, and they won't be. We had trouble digging up many of the records of people. I'm also concerned about, everybody on this call, Dominique and April, we have the wherewithal to, get these records. I'm concerned also about Pookie and Jamal on the street corner, who may have a history of enslavement, but at the same time, they don't have the time or effort to do this, to actually go back and trace their history. I've worked 15 years and I've been able to trace the patrilineal part of my family back to 1827 in Virginia. A guy by the name of Fountain Windbush. He was enslaved. And I've been stuck there because the records of how he got to the United States, and we believe that his father was from the continent, have been destroyed on the plantation. We can't go any further. So I can prove that he was enslaved, but we assume, and Darity assumes, that these records are intact, neat, and ready for you to download on your computer, and they're not. I'm going to stop there. I got a whole lot to say, but I'm going to just stop there for a minute.
Well, why don't we go on to Ronnie, and then I have some questions to pose, and the students and Teresa and Shirley may also have questions. But Ronnie, you want to give your a presentation on the Reparations Coalition and your reasons for not wanting the discussion of eligibility? And also, Ronnie, I'm sorry. I do want you, I was going to ask the question, but if you don't mind, or if you do, because I didn't warn you about this, Darity makes a point opposing local reparations. So
Yeah.
if you could include something in your presentation about that, if you can.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So first of all, Professor Mother Warrior Adwa, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be in the space with you and to give back just a little in a few minutes what you, Baba Winbush, and others have given to this movement. So every time I'm with y'all, I'm humbled and I'm on the verge of tears because I know the struggle, at least a little bit that y'all have told us and that we've read about, and it's just an honor to be with both of you. And of course, Teresa, with you, uh, Mother Trailer, and these students, of course, who are our future. So thank you. Mama Professor Adwa asked me to talk a little bit about the DC Reparations Coalition. Just a little background. So DC Emancipation Day. And Dominique, if you could remind me, if I forget to talk about DC Emancipation Day and what that is, could you like raise your finger like they do in the church just to bring me back? But last year on DC Emancipation Day, there was a public hearing about the reintroduction of a bill that proposed three things related to reparations. One, like many local reparations efforts around the country, California, Evanston, other places, to create a task force to study reparations. What is it? How would it apply in DC? And to deal with some of these big questions, eligibility being one of them. Two, to establish a database that the task force could use for research purposes. And three, to establish a reparations fund that would be held by the DC government and from which disbursements, reparations payments would be made to DC residents. So we had this big hearing. The bill was introduced by Council Member Kenyon McDuffie. Mama Audrey, I think it was the second time he actually has introduced this bill. And about 115, 120 folks showed up to testify. And there was overwhelming response and support, with rare exception. There were maybe one or two folks who were against reparations in DC, but everybody who showed up said, yeah, like not only should we be doing this, but DC as the nation's capital is late to the party. Because there are local reparations movements and projects happening all over the country and frankly all over the world. And so after that meeting, and Mama Audrey, you presented at that meeting. I remember your testimony. Number of folks from Cobra. After that meeting, myself, Timmy Bennett, who's at the IF Foundation for Radical Possibility, Patrice Sultan, who's at the DC Justice Lab, we just started asking questions like, we had all of these people who showed up. What do we do? And how do we actually continue to kind of keep this issue of reparations in DC alive? And so we just said, hey, let's just start bringing folks together to like see like what people's appetite might be for like continuing to do advocacy around this work. And sure enough, folks said, yes, we got to keep going. And I'm going to answer your question very directly about why we stayed away from eligibility right now, Mama Adrian. So our agreement was that we would meet every month. And because the bill had been introduced and was in play, there were two things that needed to happen. One, we needed to look more closely at the bill to see did we agree with all the tenets in the bill? And so the people in the coalition said, you know what? We're going through this line by line. And Mama Audrey, remember all those meetings we went through it line by line? And then the second thing was, how do we actually keep pressure on the council to actually pass the bill when it's time? And so we met every month. So we started in July of last year. And in the first 3 or 4 meetings, the meetings were an hour and a half, Mama Audrey.
Mm-hmm.
About an hour of the conversation was about the issue of eligibility. And folks were on all sides. And it was vitriolic. And it was disruptive. It really prevented us from getting to the kind of first step in the project, which was to review the bill. And I kind of see myself as a pretty good facilitator. People hire me to do that, but I realized that in every meeting, the first 3 or 4 meetings, we were losing control of the agenda and the room. And so I finally, and then in consultation with some other folks, said, hey, look, the bill is about establishing a task force, establishing a fund, and establishing a database. And we got to get the bill first. Eligibility is not even a question if we don't have a bill. And so here's, I'm from my mother's family, Dr. Winbush. I can't trace mine back past plantation in Georgia. It's Thomas family in South Georgia. Here's how we say it in Georgia. Here's what I said to the coalition. All right, what we finna do, what we finna do is we're gonna have a conversation about the bill for the next few meetings. We are not the task force, right? The task force will take, just like every other place in the country, the task force will take up the question of eligibility. Our job right now is to work on the bill so that then we can move to public advocacy to make sure that the bill gets passed. And we had a few skirmishes after that, but for the most part, folks kind of jumped on board, jumped in, and we were able to, line by line, with about 40 people on each call, we went through a whole piece of legislation. And I bet you there were about 20, 24 different revisions and recommendations that we made. We're very proud of that work. And Mama Audrey, I just want to also say that for the purposes of this call, you've noticed that I'm not here to state my personal position on the question of eligibility. I'm trying to maintain my role as a neutral arbiter, particularly as I'm helping to run the coalition. But I'm very clear that as the task force gets seated, takes up the issue of eligibility, I do fully expect that the coalition and all the interested partners will be a part of that public debate, and that should decide the question of eligibility for the Reparations Project in DC. DC, oh no, you asked about local reparations. So I strongly disagree with Professor Darity about the kind of point he raises that the federal government should be the only entity paying reparations because it is the only one that's large enough. So there are all kinds of other reasons why, for me, that argument falls apart. One, the government, in my opinion, might have been the fulcrum, but there are a whole bunch of actors, including corporations, individual actors, folks who the government basically was doing their bidding, right? And so the government may have been the doorway or been holding the bag, if you will, but we see this today. The economy is owned by kind of political economic the government is held hostage and owned by other political economic actors who we don't see. And they need to be held accountable and they need to pay too. So that's one. Two, states had their own kind of legislation, practices, policies, upholding not just the institution of slavery, but Mama Audrey, as you've taught us, and all of the legacies and the structures that have done damage to Black lives, families, and communities. And so states, cities, counties, they all need to be a part of this too. But that's not even for me the kind of crux of my disagreement. That's just logical to me. But from a movement building perspective, we've seen that the federal government is not moving on this. And so what I've seen from community organizers and movement builders around the country who are working on national projects, when the national scene is not moving, we saw all the great movement builders do this. When you can't move anything on a national level, then you go local. And you just keep winning those local fights until they add up and they force the national government's hand. And so I think and maybe Professor Darity has another algorithm to kind of determine why he thinks the federal government should be the only one. But maybe he's not considering movement building, but from a movement building and politics perspective, it only makes sense that we use the power of local jurisdictions in order to force the hand of the national government. So anyway, so that's the kind of source of my disagreement and how I see navigating the kind of conversation between federal government, local jurisdictions, and frankly, other actors who have thrown rocks, who are hiding their hands and hoping we never call their name.
Talk about Emancipation Day.
Oh, yes. So
raise your hand, Dominic.
Yeah, there you go, Dominic. There you go. So two other things about DC that when we were doing our research about DC and reparations, the DC Emancipation Act happened in 1862. Now, professors, y'all help me with my history here. About a year before 1863, is that when the Emancipation Proclamation happened in 1863? So the DC Emancipation Act was a precursor. It was Abraham Lincoln's kind of test run for like, what would happen if you freed enslaved Africans? And so the DC Emancipation Act in 1862 freed enslaved Africans in Washington, D.C. And guess who got reparations? The slave owners. And so we point when the country says, well, we can't do reparations. Like, we're like, well, you've done it in many cases, and you even paid the enslavers of Africans in Washington, D.C. for it in a piece of legislation that was a forerunner for what we know as the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's the first thing. The second thing is D.C. itself, the first 10 acres that George Washington went to go find like where Washington, D.C. was going to be between Maryland and Virginia, the first 10 acres came from a plantation holder. First 10 acres of Washington, D.C. were built on a plantation, came from a plantation. That's the second thing. And then the third thing is the labor that was used to build Washington, D.C., enslaved labor, right? In today's dollars, slave owners, when slavery was kind of like on the decline, the transatlantic slave trade was on the decline, and the internal slave trade was starting to pick up, and Washington, D.C. was kind of like the crossroads, all that was happening, and they were building Washington, D.C., slave owners got $27,000 per slave per year in today's dollars to loan out enslaved Africans to build Washington, D.C. So like all of these things are like swirling. And to go back to Darity's argument about local fights, national fights, there's a particular thing that Washington, D.C. can do that no other jurisdiction that we know right now. We need to get some researchers to look at this. Washington, D.C. for a long time was not a city to itself. And still to this day is not a state. It's a federal colony, basically. And so the trauma that was happening with Black people, whether they were enslaved or freed Black people in DC, was happening because of the legislative power of the federal government. This is before DC had their own government. And so then when DC finally gets their own government, of course, they take the baton and they continue the trauma against Black people. The point here is that and to this day, DC has two different governments. not only do we have our mayor and our city council, but we also have to run our legislation, key legislation by Congress, because the federal government has oversight over DC budget, all kinds of things. And because of our relationship with both the federal government and because we have our own city government, DC can actually make a double claim. We can actually make a claim on the federal government as part of our local fight, because they are part of our local government. And we can make a claim on the city council and the mayor and the city government. So like we actually can bring the national fight, federal government, and the local fight together in a way that no other jurisdiction can. At least that's our understanding right now. We got some folks taking a look at that to clarify that for us. All right, Mama Adjua, I think I've answered all the questions.
Let's open it up for a bit. I have some questions, but I want to see what others may have as well. And I can always ask mine or not. Somebody may have it. So let's open it up. Any other comments? Ray, do you have anything you want to add? Or April, Shirley, Teresa, Dominique?
Well, I'm just briefly, what you said, Ronnie, about the local stuff is so important. You know, the thing that boggles my mind about Darity and his group, whatever the ADOS and FBA and all those folks, is that if you got to always look at history, as Malcolm said, as being our best teacher. And so if you look at the civil rights movement, for example, it was pressed at the local level, Birmingham, Selma, all of that. And it put so much pressure locally that the federal had to do something. If you look at Charlie Houston and Thurgood Marshall, when they were, you know, before they went to Brown versus Board, you know, people have asked, why did they go to Topeka, Kansas, of all places? They knew that if they put pressure locally, it would eventually go up to the Supreme Court. I don't know why Darity doesn't understand that. And the importance of local initiatives, you just can't, you know, exaggerate their importance. You know, I'm on the Baltimore Reparations Commission, which was, you know, from created not only Baltimore, but in Prince George's County. We're pretty, and we've said point blank, we asked on the first day that we met, is anybody here for eligibility? As 18 of us, and nobody, we are going to be the first Pan-African Black nationalist reparations commission that recommends what we think ought to occur. And I think that, you know, the idea of, you know, going back to the issue of the local initiatives that's the, you know, what did the white boy Tip O'Neill say? All politics is local. And we've got to remember that when it comes to reparations.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I was hoping, thank you both so much for being here to talk to us about this topic. It's kind of near and dear to my heart because it is the topic I'm studying for the handbook we're creating. And I wanted to know what you all felt. I think like everyone has an idea and an opinion, but what are the parameters that you see needing to be set in terms of eligibility? If not lineage, how do you view, you know, reparations being cut off or open to certain groups?
Ronnie, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm just gonna say that for this call and given my role as a facilitator of the reparations coalition in DC, it's not a question that I'm gonna answer publicly. Eventually, when I step out of my role as facilitator, I'll answer it very strongly. But I will say, I believe in Black people. And I believe we're gonna get it right. Right. And so that's what I'll say for right now. So please ask me another question, but this is one that I really can't address right now.
Well, I can.
Well, before you go on, Ray, I think though, Ronnie, you can address it from the perspective of the what we put in the when we edited the bill that we
Well,
talked about. I mean, we talked about when we edited the bill, we edited it so that it was broader recipients than just people who were descended from enslaved Africans.
well, I'm glad you brought that up, Mama Adjua. What we did was, because we were trying to stay neutral as a coalition at this point. Now we're going to actually debate this issue, but like for the purposes of just getting the bill passed, we're like, that's actually not essential right now. But for the purposes of the bill, we actually had, we put placeholder language in, and we tried to actually write the bill in a way, I'm glad you said this, Mama Adjua, so that we didn't tip our hand in support of either Pan-Africanism or foundational Black Americans. And so, and we signal that to the council, again, with our kind of expectation that the task force would engage the conversation around eligibility more closely, and that we would be a part of that public debate. So yeah, you're right, Mama Adjua. We did kind of write, as I'm doing right now, we wrote in a way so we didn't tip one way or another. And I will say again, I do believe in Black people, and I do believe that we will get this right.
What I want to say is that this whole argument, we've got to, and I'm answering your question, Dominique, that we've got to understand, why is this even being debated at this point? I just put in the chat an article that was published in the Final Call about 3 or 4 years ago. The Final Call from the Nation of Islam did a very thorough investigation. You have to look at the origins of ADOS. Who is backing them? They are being backed primarily by white anti-immigrant groups that are very conservative, Trump supporters all the way. And they knew that if they brought this issue of eligibility out, which was first brought out by ADOS, and then again when ADOS split into FBA, they took it even further. They knew it would divide Black America. You could actually have a neighbor who could trace their eligibility living next door to a Black person who couldn't. And it would further divide, Black folk. If you have a chance, read that article, because it's very important to understand, why are we even asking this question now? And Ronnie, when you say that the first few meetings of your group were battling back and forth, that's one of the purposes of it, is to create confusion among Black folk. So I've got people coming up to me and said, well, are you going to give reparations to people who just got over here from Jamaica? Those questions weren't even asked 10 years ago. They became very popular at the beginning of the Trump administration, and that's when most of these groups took off, as well as got their money. Read the article. It was very well done. Just read the article when you have a chance.
Dominique, did he answer your question?
Probably not. But let me say that I'm for Black people.
Re-ask it, Dominique, so Ray Wimbush Dr. Wimbush could specifically answer it?
Well, I'll just say that I think, just graduated from law school, and when we're thinking in terms of litigation, we're wanting to know, how are we going to talk about harm? How can we connect that to a plaintiff? And so, in terms of, I know there's a place for reparations in legislatures as well as in the courtroom. From the courtroom perspective, how well do you see us defining a plaintiff who deserves harm when it comes to trying to, I guess, advocate for reparations in the courtroom space?
You didn't mean deserves harm, who deserves a remedy or reparations for?
Yes, thank you.
Well, again, if you remember Charles Ogletree, Adjua, I think that you were involved with the lawsuit in Tulsa.
Yeah.
We thought the standing was going to be, standing was brought up you know, and Audrey will correct me if I'm wrong, one of the judges in the Tulsa case, what was that, 2006 or 2007?
2000 and, the case was actually filed in 2002 or 2003, but
Right.
the opinion came down in 2004.
Right. And the judge said, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that the people in Tulsa, Oklahoma should have filed that lawsuit at the time of the harm.
Mm.
And so go on.
Well, what the judge said was, we made, and Eric Miller, who was one of our speakers early in this period of this series, I think he was here in April, was the attorney at that point. He was a fellow who he actually wrote the argument for equitable estoppel, equitable tolling. The judge said that we had made the case for that because we showed that the plaintiffs could not have successfully brought a lawsuit. They could have brought a lawsuit, but of all the judges in that era at that point were Klansmen. Some of the information of even knowing the involvement of the city, for example, was not known until the commission started in like late 1990s or early 2000s. I can't remember the year. What the judge did, which I think is what you're referring to or remembering, is the judge, and I called him then, and Charles, I can still see Charles' scowl on his face when I said it at this public meeting in Philadelphia after the case was decided. The judge was racist. So what the judge did is he found the book, Ellsworth's book, that was written in 1980 something, that didn't nobody know anything about Ellsworth's book at all. But he found that book and said that was when our clients should have known and should have brought the case. So that's what happened there.
You know, sister, you know, Dominique, you know, I have a friend of mine, and she always says, sometimes I wish white folks would simply call me and the N-word. I mean, she said, rather than, you know, do all these dances around legally. I'm thinking about the case with Deidre Farmer Pillman up in Chicago in the 5th district, I believe. And, you know, some of what the rulings were there. See, I kind of proceed with the idea that white people don't want to give us reparation. You know, I start at that point. It's not like they're just waiting to do this. And you got to look at, we talked to the people, or I did at least, that filed the lawsuits with the Japanese, you know, in the early 1980s. White people didn't want to give the Japanese anything. Native Americans, there was a pushback on that. So I think you have to proceed with the idea that this is going to be a tough fight. And I think the harm, as far as I'm concerned, has to do with the, you know, the 5 injuries that Cobra talks about. It has to do with the issue, one of which is wealth and housing. You know, you've got to do that. I was on the reason why I got this background behind me, because I was on a call this afternoon, a panel, in fact, with what's her name up in Evanston? Bruce Simmons. You know, we gave a workshop for enterprise about housing and stuff. And you probably heard last week, you know, they were sued, saying that you know, this was under the 14th Amendment of the Equal Protection Clause, that white people should have got reparations up in Evanston as well. So, you know, you got to realize that no matter what you're doing legally, in whatever area, that you're going to get pushback from people classified as white. And that maybe the legal theory about showing harm has not yet been developed. And it may be up to you to do the development of it.
I love it. I love it. Can I also jump in here on this? Professor Wimbush, I'm glad you raised the Evanston suit. You know, as we've been doing the work with the DC Reparations Coalition, as much as we finally got to a place where the coalition is really neutral at this point, you know, I've tried to look at all sides of the argument just to like so that I would know as a facilitator. And you know, one of the things that um, is in the public ether and zeitgeist is this is the backlash that we're seeing with the lawsuits. So Evanston, Fearless Fund, REI, DEI backlash, affirmative action, and you even have states right now. I think it was a congressperson in Texas or somewhere that's like, you can't use the word reparation. Like all of this is happening, and we are having to like fight this fight in a country that has used every means, legal, education, medical, economy, but like to undermine Black life. And I'm reminded of, and y'all remember this name, Randall Robinson, right? You know, the book, The Debt He Wrote, What America Owes Black People. But then the book he wrote after that was The Reckoning, What Black People Owe Each Other. And part of what I'm hoping this is why I start with like, I believe in, I trust Black people. I hope that as we fight for reparations out there, just who was it? What was the name of that movie? James Earl Jones, is that his name? James Earl Jones, remember the actor? He was playing it was a Vernon John story. That's the name of the movie, Vernon John story. He was the pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church before King showed up. And a lot of folks said that Vernon Johns was like John the Baptist, to be Christocentric for a second, and King was Jesus, just from a metaphorical perspective. If you know anything about John the Baptist, who's very crass and so on and so forth. Vernon John said before King got there, if you see a good fight, get in it.
That's right.
And what my hope is I hope we win reparations. But what I also hope is that in the process of fighting for reparations, we could find each other and fight not each other, but fight together. And as we are fighting against the system that was designed to kill us, the process of fighting with each other will be a part of our repair and healing amongst ourselves, right? Now, I hope we win, but even if we don't win, right? My hope is that that level of repair, the repair that we can do it ourselves, happens. Now, I just want to make sure everybody clear. I want the check. I want the full program. But the thing we can do is repair ourselves, and we don't need the American government, state governments, corporations. We don't need anybody to do that. We can do that amongst ourselves.
The things, and you're reminding me, and then I'll see if April or Teresa have anything they want to ask or comment on. To Dominique's point, and part of I think I'll say why I think the question of harm is at the surface for her and perhaps the other people, is because of the Supreme Court's decisions that say that you just can't get, relief for societal discrimination. You have to show harm and a compelling state interest, da 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 da. Okay. So I think that's the perspective that, and it's the correct perspective. I'm not being critical at all, Dominique, of that question, because that we have to, when we present our material, our handbook, we've got to be able to lay out what it is. If in fact you're going to file a lawsuit, or even with legislation, you need to make sure. This is the question with Evanston that I raised in the first meeting last week. you can't just say it's harm-based. Where's the report on the harm? That's what we learned when we had our constitutional experts, that the city just can't agree, oh yeah, we did it. You have to have a harms report. You have to have that, so that if you went to court, you could have proved that you did X, Y, and Z. So I wanted to lay that foundation, because on the
Interesting.
one hand, it seems to me, I know I'm saying it seems to me, but that on the one hand, we've got two arguments going on. One hand, we've got to make a legal argument, and or say that, if you do ABC, you'll be exposed to legal liability if somebody challenges it. But on the other hand, I think that we have what I embrace, and you and the two of you and others embrace, is for me, it's a correct political analysis of the debt that's owed. That, and that what we see, and I wrote an article some time ago that talks about how we see that the whole racial hierarchy that was constructed, and that's why they talk about the social construction of race, the racial hierarchy that was constructed by this German in 16 something or whatever, it's in my article, was one that was adopted by whites in power, and it went, and so the gradations of color went down to blacks at the bottom, so that self-constructed racial hierarchy is what the system in the United States and other places too, but we're dealing here with the United States, is consistently upholding. So that if we look at, and the students know, or the recent grad who was a student a month ago, 2 months ago, know, in the first property case in the United States that established the property ownership was a case in which a colonial person, or was a white person, was trying to get land from a Native American. And the Native Americans' theory of property was no ownership. You use it, you have it, you use it, you stay here, you can stay here a week, you can stay here 10 years, you can stay however long, but it wasn't owned. And when you move over and go somewhere else, somebody else can come and that property. So that case decided that property ownership, the concept of Euro concept of property ownership, was the law of the land, was going to be the law of the land. But what that did is it established white supremacy.
Right.
It was a legal establishment of white supremacy. So one of the hard things, I think, for law students, or creating a handbook that is going to be used, is making, you have to make a legal argument that it is itself is built on white supremacy. The law in this country is built on white supremacy.
Wow.
The narrowing of the of the rights of Black people were not done because of, some, absolute correct analysis. It was done because it was a narrowing of the rights. They said, oops, we went too far. So they've been chopping back, chopping back, chopping back, chopping back. That's just my analysis. That's kind of legal based, but it's also political based. It's what we can see, right? If we are not in denial. So the issue, I think, that, for example, that Dominique raised, and that all the students are all of us, not just the students and the recent grad. I'm sorry, Dominique, I keep remembering after I say it, is how do we present both arguments? How do we do correct justification? You see what I'm saying? Of the law, so that we aren't misleading, because this handbook is for people, commissions. This handbook, Ray, is for your group. This handbook will be for the task force that is formed in DC, the kind of guidelines. So I think that the reality is that we have to figure out a way of combining in some way, and I have an idea how we'll do it, but I gotta brainstorm it some more to myself and then Teresa, is to how do we do it so that we are telling the truth on both sides, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how I got off on that, but I do, because something you said. But go
I was
ahead.
just going to add to that like the commissions are going to be asked that question, right? Like they're going to be asked the question about like the person who comes into the country, you know, a week, a month before reparations is enacted, and are they eligible? And part of what we have to do in our handbook is help them figure out how to create something that addresses that.
Mhm.
So,
Question. Mhm,
yeah.
mhm, mhm. I guess
So
I'm going.
I just want to.
I have a couple questions, but go on.
This has nothing to do with the technicality of the legal arguments you're putting down. It's more of a, I don't even know what to call it. So my wife, Unique Redwood, and I, one of our favorite books is the title of it is, I'm trying to remember the author again, but the title of the book is The Answer to How is Yes. The answer to how is yes. And the premise is that whenever you put an idea on the table and you keep getting a whole bunch of how questions from the folks that you're talking to, what they're signaling to you, and Bob Wimbush, you started with this, they don't want to really do it. And somehow or another, we're in a conversation about reparations for Black folks who have been severely and who suffer ongoing harm and trauma up until this very minute and second that we are on this Zoom as a consequence of the American system. And somehow or another, and this isn't directed at anybody on this call, this is about the big argument. Somehow or another, we get pigeonholed into an argument about, well, what about somebody who showed up 2 weeks? Can we talk about the folks y'all dragged here 400 years ago, to the folks that y'all put in the prisons? Can we talk about the neighborhoods you gentrified, the schools that you can we talk about that and not, why do we have to talk about the people who just arrived 2 weeks ago, right? To your point, Teresa, right? And so it's really just, if our people could just see enough of us, because all of us won't see it, all of this is subterfuge. Like,
It is. Go ahead. Go ahead.
They don't want to do it. Like this is all a signal that they don't want to do it. And so, like, if we could ever just and I don't know if there have been moments in history where we've come together and realized like how we're being divided and conquered, but like, man, we're at another moment for sure.
We are, and see, I would ask, like one of the things I always get from white folks when I'm giving lectures to them, they'll say, well, didn't Black people enslave Black people? And then I have to make these arguments about, it's not making an argument, but about the initiators, the victims, and the collaborators and the differences between them. But it's important, like, see, I said it, Teresa, earlier. I don't think when white folks went into the forest and said, we got to get some Black folk, and I'm not, this was all due respect, and I love you to death, but I'm saying they didn't say, well, that African came into the village 2 weeks ago, so we're not going to, get them. We just want, they're setting up criteria for us to prove eligibility that they have never had eligibility for. We just had to be Black. They didn't care what part of the continent we came from, our ancestors came from. They just said, just get some Black folk over here, we're going to enslave. That's it. And I think now, that's why I have this visceral response to Darity, because he said, well, we've got to have, look, let me tell you, somebody said they came in 2 weeks to the United States. I would ask her, where you come from? Jamaica. Did you have any racism over there? They might say no. And if they do say no, I said, well, we're not going to give you reparations. But they say, yeah, let me tell you what happened to me at my job there. I'm ready to give them reparations. But see, again, I'm from a Pan-African point of view too. The African people are the same all over the world.
I was just gonna say that I understand the purpose of the handbook now, and God knows we're gonna need it in DC. Like, can put us at the top of the list. Put us at the top of the list. And so, and we're not gonna be able to legalese our way into this and out of it. Like, we gotta have something to go to the fight. I'm saying that, but like, they gotta say yes first. They gotta say yes first. That's how I'm looking at it. They gotta say yes first. We'll work out the details later. If you're trying to work out all the details before we get to yes, it's not gonna happen. And so please keep it going. Like, let us look over your shoulder. And the courts have a role. They certainly got a role in this system. We got, like, there's no way around it. And whatever legal argument we put forward, they've proven this. Like, as tight as it will be.
You know, I gotta say one more
Let
thing.
me, if I could just interrupt the 1 second, and I want us to keep talking, but I really want to focus on, I found, as I said, when we first started, I think before we even got open, the whole session was started, there's some contradictions in the argument for lineage that is presented by Darity. The argument that he makes for lineage, he makes the argument that there should be a connection, let's put it this way, whether it's one parent or both, to an ancestor that was enslaved. He then argues also, and I think it's an also because I don't see how it can be connected, that the role of reparations would be to close the wealth gap. My question is, and it's to our speakers, but also everyone to consider, Dominique, April, Shirley, Teresa, everybody. Is there a contradiction? Is there a contradiction between lineage, a lineage that he outlines? An ancestor is only people who can get reparations, and he defines reparations as money. So he's not dealing with Dominique and April and Teresa. We've talked about, if you know, it's no way you can do a lineage argument. Well, I guess it could be, but it'd be really convoluted when you're talking about reparations as forms of changes in structures. You can't put a sign up and say this structure is a result of reparations because the structure, the criminal punishment system, these changes are being made because they negatively injured, and that's a mild word, and y'all know it's a mild word, Black folk, because they were targeted to be put in these prisons that did blah 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 blah. And so what we're going to do is change the rules, and some of us are arguing for abolition, period, right? So you can't put a sign up and say, but the only ones that won't go into prison anymore are those who can prove that they are a descendant of an enslaved African. So on the one hand, the structural changes of reparations, if you apply the lineage argument to it, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So he's only talking about money. He's only talking about that check, that 300,000 you talked about, Ronnie, earlier, that this ballot initiative is talking about, whatever the check. Is there, I see a contradiction, but maybe I'm the only one that sees it. Is there a contradiction in his own argument? We're talking about his argument, not anybody else's argument, that in fact, only people who can trace the ancestry, even if it's just one parent, to an enslaved African, and we want to, that the purpose of reparations is to close the wealth gap. That's my question. I want to hear from whoever, and Dominique, I want you to weigh in on that because you're dealing with eligibility, so this is a think hard question.
But you know, I wrote Darity years ago when he first got involved with ADOS. You know, they've also threatened him too, right? Oh, okay, I could go into that. That's a whole nother sort. He See, it's hard to really talk about Darity. It would be, and I hate to use, maybe this is a bad analogy, but it's like trying to talk to Clarence Thomas about affirmative action on this eligibility question. He's wedded to it, him and his wife. That was his wife in that video. And
Mullen.
right. And
But
you know,
how do you resolve? I'm gonna keep you on point. How do you resolve that contradiction? Do you see the contradiction? What is the contradiction?
I don't think he cares. I think
No, I'm not talking about him. He's
Right.
putting this out to a population that we have to educate. So it's not about him changing, it's his theory. If we all heard it. I'm not trying to say if we heard it. We all heard it. We all heard that one, only people have connected ancestry. Two, for reparations. Money and reparations is money. Two, that is to close the wealth gap. And he said a couple other things that we can talk about later, but what is that contradiction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
well,
that's a good question.
What's the
I think
contradiction?
the wealth gap started, you know, I know the story about John Punch in 1640 when, you know, John O. Franklin told us this in class, uh, you know, the wealth gap is just another way of saying how effective racism was in taking money away from Black people to white people. And if he says, and I'm talking about he being Darity, that we need we need reparations to close the wealth gap. I mean, that's like, to me, like a truism, you know.
But who makes up? I guess the point I'm trying to make is, maybe I'm being too simplistic and people are missing my point. The wealth gap is comprised, Black and white wealth gap is not just comprised of Black folk who have an ancestor who is
Right.
connected to
Right,
slavery.
exactly.
That's
But
my point.
right.
That's the contradiction. If
Right.
you're going to close the wealth gap, you got to give money to Black folk who can't trace their ancestry to an enslaved African. That's an internal contradiction in his argument.
Well,
That's
I agree.
but the thing that to Bobby Winbush's point, yes, that's a contradiction for Pan-Africanists, but for ADOS Foundation, I'm not trying to be apologist for either side, but in their minds, they don't care about. In their minds, they are thinking about.
Cut the check.
That's right. Cut the check to people whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States. That's the only part of the racial wealth gap that they're concerned about. I agree.
That's not what he's saying.
No, that is what
not
he's saying.
saying that.
No, but
He is saying there is a wealth gap.
Yes.
That reparations needs to close. If
But-
you're
but-
going to close the wealth gap, I'm
You
not
gotta
trying
take
to
all
argue.
Black
And
people.
exactly. So my point is, and I've had this. My point is, and Ray knows when they first 2018, when Ray and Conrad Worrell and all of them are all upset about ADOS, my statement was, don't argue with them, right? Just remember that, Ray?
I remember.
I mean, all of that. Because my point is this, and then I'm gonna shut up and see what others, students and grad and Teresa may want to add to this. My point is this: we give them too much air, and we don't meet the argument because we're giving them too much air. We're making it about Darity and not doing the analysis. I think, this is my view, okay? Let me take ownership. This is Ajua's view. That we don't meet the argument head on because we're so busy dealing with, and they have actually created this kind of, as you pointed out, Ray, and I think you pointed out, Ronnie, in terms of our coalition, that they make it a fight between them and us, as opposed to us meeting the argument. The argument that was made by Darity, that Teresa did an I think, an excellent job. I don't know what y'all think, but I think it was an excellent job of putting those clips together
Oh,
that
wow.
kind of showed a fullness of his argument in different ways. We have to meet the argument. We have to say that you aren't going to close the wealth gap by only giving reparations to
The
people who are descended from enslaved Africans. We need to, and I know he gets under your skin, Ray. He always has since this stuff has started. But I think, for me at least, and I'm not, Teresa and I are semi-teachers for the students and the recent grad, but we're also collaborators. And what I want, if nothing else, I know we're going to be successful in getting a great handbook out, but if nothing else, I want us to learn and them to learn that you meet the argument.
Okay, but what
What
if you
is
do
the
meet the
argument?
argument? What if you meet like an impenetrable argument and present it to Darity? What you just said to me is impenetrable. You know,
But see, I'm not worried about Darity, because
okay, but
what I'm
anybody
saying is,
else,
what I'm saying is, if we can meet the argument, whoever is making the argument, we can meet that argument. For me, I think that we have contributed, and this is not something new, because this is what I was saying back in 2018, and we're arguing with you and Conrad and all of, and what's his name, Thomas, I'm blanking on the man's
Believe
name.
Kweli, he
You
was
know,
in.
but
Go ahead.
the point I'm making is, and this is my point, the point I'm making is, if we make it less about the personality and focus, so that this is the argument that's being made by this guy with 9 million, I don't know how many PhDs he has, maybe he only has 1 PhD, and his collaborator, who also happens to be his wife, but it makes no sense.
Okay, but what if we write about that? We publicize it, not about him, but to anyone who makes the argument that closing the wealth gap is
Can't do it. Yeah.
right. That if we make a solid argument that closing the wealth gap is, you cannot do it by just, including Black people who prove their slave ancestry or something.
Right.
I don't think they're going to listen to it.
But, but they're not. Let's see. I think we give them air. I think it's my same argument that I make about the Democrats and Trump. I think Trump won, and this is just Agile. I'm sure other people have the view too, but I'm saying Agile. I think Trump won the first election he won because all the media, they didn't focus on what's her name, Clinton's platform. They started everything with Trump. When she started her debate, she started everything with Trump. One thing I learned in law school, now y'all tell me if they still teaching it, is you don't start with the argument of your opponent. You start with your argument. You lay out your argument, and then you come back around and may say, and then that's what I learned in brief writing. That's what I learned in presenting cases. So, and that's my point, both in terms of, I gave the example of Trump and Clinton, but my point with Darity, we get stuck. And so we got all these fancy people, Ray and all these people with all these credentials. They will listen.
You think so?
Yeah.
Because
So.
I quit talking to him about 2 years ago.
No, when I say they, I mean people will listen.
Oh, people, yeah.
They will listen because people, I think there's a few people who are stuck. But there are other people who aren't stuck and really want to learn. You have your hand, Ronnie.
April had her hand up for a while.
Oh, I don't see her. Where's your hand? I don't see.
Characteristically quiet because I think logically I follow this argument, and so I was trying to think of a question and I didn't have one. Yeah, I didn't have one because I feel like the example of Amadou Diallo and institutional racism is a clear-cut example of how just targeting Black Americans would not be would not suffice, right? If we wanted to address reparations and reparative justice. So I wanted to answer Professor Ajua's question, but then I also wanted to kind of switch the discussion a little bit based off of one of the commissions that I was researching. But my answer to Professor Ajua's question was like, I agree that the lineage argument and systematic racism doesn't coincide if you're trying to close the wealth gap, because racial capitalism is always growing, right? It's always expanding. So there's always another way that people are profiting off of Black people and the African diaspora. And yeah, I could go further, but I think the point again about Amadou Diallo is just, that says it all. And if we look at the gentrification of Black communities, and then also a point that I read in, I don't know what the acronym, sorry, wait, let me look it up. The National African American Reparations Commission, they just were talking about how, first of all, like the immigration system is anti-Black, but then also like when you have African and those of the African diaspora even integrating into American society, how they may excel at a certain point faster than Black Americans, but then eventually it becomes one-on-one with the Black American because of institutional racism. And so, yeah, I say all that to say the wealth gap, you can't close the wealth gap by targeting one specific Black person and not the whole Black population. So I'm curious about buy-in, and I'm also just curious about, when I say buy-in, I'm curious, like, how do we, that have expanded this notion of eligibility so wide that it has included white people. And so we've been like challenged to think of possible litigation cases that would address this one specific harm, and one specific commission expanded eligibility so broad in thinking of poverty and urban renewal that white people got reparations. So Professor Dr. Wimbush, what's your answer to that?
Yeah, Dr. Wimbush.
My answer to that, I'm gonna just tell you what I think. You know, Francis Welsing and Neely Fuller say that the number one tool of the system of white supremacy is deceit. And I agree with that. Secondly, I'd offer you to read Frank Wilderson's book, Afro-Pessimism.
Oh,
It's a wonderful book, and he teaches out at Berkeley, and Wilderson says that no matter what Black people do, we could have airtight arguments on the issue of eligibility, say this is the reason why under the 14th Amendment that white people are not supposed to be getting reparations. He said, no, if we could invented a cure for AIDS, COVID, and sold it for $2 in a pill, that white people will always see us as subhuman. And that's a strong argument. It's a strong assertion, but I think it's true. I think that any commission, and directly to answer your point, any commission that allows white people to get reparations, something's wrong. And that's why we started out the commission in Baltimore by saying, if you are not, and there were 18 of us, so if you are not taking a Pan-Africanist approach, and they all knew what that was, and a Black nationalist approach, we don't think you should be on this commission, because we've looked at DC, we've looked at Evanston, the California Commission, as well as San Francisco, some of these reports, and all of us conclude that this is the only way that those arguments can be made, and you're going to get pushback. I was surprised. I mean, I wasn't surprised when Robin and their group got sued last week, because that's the way white folks are. They're going to sue DC. You know, they're going to sue Baltimore, you know, because that's the way they operate. And I'm sorry if I'm stereotyping white folks, and I'm not saying there's not any white allies out there, but they're very few and far between. So I would say press on and meet it head on. When you get sued, we're expecting to get sued in Baltimore. We put, what's that little thing you do with the challenges? I forget what it calls, the name of it. You know, you put this little box up here with 4 things in it. You know what it is?
SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis.
Yeah, SWOT analysis. We did a SWOT analysis, and one of the things in our boxes is a lawsuit. We expect that to happen. And I think if anybody goes into reparations with research or activism without thinking that there's going to be major, I ain't talking about minor, major pushback, they're very naive, or they don't know the history of this struggle.
That's right. They're coming for you.
And Aju, I want to say this to you. We were wrong, Conrad and I, because we thought it was a blip. That ADOS and all of them, we thought that was a blip. And so but we pulled out of that stuff. And I'm going to tell you another thing. ADOS, Obatashaka, some of you know who he is out in California. He told me a couple of weeks ago that the only historical movement that is Black, that has been against Black people, and I'm talking about organized the way ADOS, FBA, the Freedmen, all of them are, is happening right now. This is a unique occurrence in Black American history. There's been Uncle Toms and Aunt Thomasina's before, but this idea of an organized opposition, and he said the only one that he could think of it was the Inkatha movement in South Africa during the ANC, where a Black group, you know, actively organized against another Black group.
Wow.
And that's something different.
Wow.
And when Obata, and he's a wise man, so I look at this as being something unique, and it's going to take unique and different approaches that we haven't done before.
Well, one thing I think to also address April's question as well, in addition to what you're saying, is part of the problem is, well, no, maybe I shouldn't call it a problem, but part of the issue is when you're fighting for reparations, the question many commissions are facing is, it's almost like, do I get something for Black folks, even if I have to give something to white folks, or do I not? What is the battle line, so to speak, of the commission? Ray's point, being willing to be sued if necessary, but my experience with talking with folk is some people think, and I don't think it's a small number, that it's the book you talked about, Black Pessimism, and what was the name of that book?
Afro-pessimism.
Afro-pessimism. It's like, we're not going to win anyway, so the argument goes, we're not going to win anyway, why fight at all? Or we're not going to win without white folks, so let's just do something and maybe a few white folks will get it. I remember years ago when I was working at Justice, I believe, or was it ACLU, I can't remember which, and I went home to visit in St. Louis, and I was involved. So I was right at the end of my justice period. Had started being involved in reparations. I think I told most of you the story, walking back from lunch on Pennsylvania Avenue. Anriel had remember that poster Anriel used to have, Black folks pointing, Uncle Sam pointing out at you, Black folks uncles, they owe you, US owes you, I can't remember if it said US or Uncle Sam owes you so many trillions of dollars for slavery. And I said, yeah, that's right. And that's how I got involved in the reparations movement. But I went home and I was putting up, my parents are middle class Black folk, but I'm maybe not just middle class Black folks do it. But they're inviting all their friends over. Oh, my daughter's back for her visit coming, and I had all these. You open the front door and you walk in, and there's a sign on the. You have to see the daggone sign before you can put your what was summertime, but where the closet is. And Mama said, "How come you can't never just let things, just have a party? Why you gotta always make it political?" But then people started talking. Okay, started a conversation, and that's what many of these these are school teachers, postal workers in the Black community. Those are strong middle class, right? Postal workers, teachers, and all that. And they started saying, you're right. Hear me now. You're right. We are owed reparations, but we will never get it.
Mm-hmm.
You see, so that pessimism, I think, is what April is talking about. Or not necessarily she talked about, but I think that pessimism leads people not to fight the full fight.
Now, but let me just say this, real quick in defense of Brother Wilderson. He argues that until Black people realize that white people aren't, see, I think that we've had carrot before donkey. I know some Black folk who did that, but that's
Don't call no names. Don't call no names.
no, I won't. But I think that it's important for Black folk to understand that Afro-pessimism is, and I'm not an Afro-pessimist, it's like who's the Black scholar that wrote Faces at the Bottom of the Well?
Derek Bell.
Oh, Derek Bell.
Derek Bell. It's like Derek Bell says on page 12 of Faces at the Bottom of the Well, paragraph 2. Just because there may not be any cure for AIDS doesn't mean that you don't keep fighting to get a cure for AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
We have to understand that this is a war that we are in, and it's going to be a war that I won't see the end of it in my lifetime, and many of these young people won't either. But you gotta fight it. And I think that some of us get disappointed because we really believe that white folks are going to change. And some of them will, but it ain't enough.
And I think, and I want to, I see your hand up, Ronnie, but I think for me, I also think it's embedded in the form of, it's what I said earlier, it's so embedded. The racism is so embedded in our systems. I'm not sure I would say at this point it's just white versus Black or white folk won't. I think the system is so constructed that has internalized, and Derek Bell talks about this when he talks about the racial hierarchy. It has internalized the lies that were formed to create the racial hierarchy. It has internalized the lie of in quotes Black inferiority, so that when we're looking at a case, it's not simply, I mean, you got Black folk who may defend that case because of the embeddedness in the legalese, your point, the legalese, that kind of thing. So I think it's not just, for me at least, it's not just white folk won't. The system itself is constructed by those who embrace the racial hierarchy back in the 1600s that said, yeah, Blacks are at the bottom and whites are at the top. And, whites are all these nicey nice, smart, all of this other stuff. And I wrote about it, but I can't. But there are people who don't have that view. Commissions who will say a little piece, I remember, a little piece is better than nothing, right? And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that is, in fact, I think it's wrong from my personal theory, my personal viewpoint. But I think that that's part of what you're seeing in April's question I think, raised that point, that there are commissions who are afraid
They
that,
are.
that if we really push it, we're going to be sued
Right.
or it's going to be reversed. And so we will take and say, okay, if a white person fits this description, you know, now the description may only include a few white folk, but if a white person fits this description, so be it.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to get to.
Mhm.
We have about another 6 minutes. Any other questions or
Yeah.
go
I wanted to
on,
weigh in
Ron?
on April's question because I thought her analysis about echoing your comments, Mama Adjoa, about picking particular Black people to close racial wealth gaps right on. April, to your question, what I heard was like public opinion and consciousness. Like, how do we win? Like, we got to win there.
That's a buy-in.
And the short answer for me, so I'm ordained clergy, and I'm affiliated with a couple of communions. One is the Shrine of the Black Madonna, and so I give you that qualifier because we talk in the church about your come to Jesus moment. Muslims might say come to Allah, Buddhists might say come to Buddha, you know, but your come to Jesus moment. For me, Jesus is the African revolutionary Messiah who came to turn the world upside down. That's another conversation. My question or my kind of offer is for each one of us to remember our come to Blackness moment. When did we discover and come to our Blackness? And there are still folks out there who are wrestling with that or who may be unconscious of that. And so I think that with these commissions, with these local movements, we've got to reinvest heavily in political education. And some people I've been listening think political education is like how the legislative process works. I'm like, no, that's not, we're talking about the consciousness of the people. What are your politics? And so I think that, and I think there's enough disruption and questions, particularly with young people who've watched the elders and they've said, man, the hell with all of this. I think there's an opening there. And so like political education, I think we need sophisticated, I hate social media and AI and all that stuff, but like we got to have a sophisticated strategy, right? But it's got to be a political project. So that's one thing. The second thing is, so, you know, Mama Adjoa, I see your argument about can't pick individual Black people to close the racial wealth gap. I want to put forward an argument that I put in my testimony before the council last year. You're not going to close, if you close the racial wealth gap at all, whether it's individual Black people or all Black people with reparation, it's going to be closed for about 2 seconds. Because racial capitalism, as April called it, is designed to take that money right back.
There you go.
And so if we don't have as a part of our reparations project, how are we going to replace capitalism or practice alternative models of politics and economy, right? We are, and it's not because Black folks are bad with money. We're actually better than anybody with money. It's because of the power, the extractive power of this economy. It is designed to extract, particularly from Black lives. And so, yeah, let's just say the racial wealth gap does get closed. It's going to be closed for about 2 minutes. And so we got to be also thinking as a reparative project, like what is going to be our economy. And so like Ubuntu, right? And collective work and cooperative economics and things like, we got to be thinking about that too. So Eric.
And I think you saw April. Did you see April?
That's right.
All right. But I think that part of what you're saying, and April, this goes to your buy-in. April is writing on, in her section is buy-in. How do we get people on board, involved, positive, engaged in working for reparations? And I think part of what I know what I'm hearing from Ronnie, as well as Ronnie and Ron, as well as Ray, is I think we need to educate people with the truth. And I know there's going to be pushback. There always is pushback. whatever theory we have to explain pushback, I have one theory, you may have another. There's going to be pushback. But we need to be able to develop a political education series or sessions, whatever we want to call them, that talk about the truth of why reparations is owed, right? Not, not sugarcoat it, so to speak, but not put it in language that is such that it pushes people back, other than those who just gonna be pushed back because you're just telling the truth. But we need to be able to tell the story, because the point that Ray made, and I think Ronnie's made a similar point, and maybe in another way, is the comeback. If you talk about slavery, and that's your naysayers, they've done a series on naysayers, what the naysayers are saying, and they each have written something about that. But the naysayers say what? Ray's point. Well, Black folks own Africans too. That's a naysayer. What's your comeback? How do we develop a comeback? I mean, there are comebacks. Ray made one today, and there are others. A naysayer says, well, my family didn't own enslaved Africans. What's your comeback? So we have to be able to show, and April goes specifically to April's piece that she's writing, but I dare say to all of us that we have to be able to answer with the truth. And we've got the truth. We've got it. We've got historians who have documented the history, of the treatment of Black folk from slavery till today. So I think that we have to be able to wrap it. And that's why from the very beginning, I said, don't be arguing with this guy, Adolphs, and da, 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 da. And now I hear my brother here saying, you were right. We stopped after a while. But I think we have so much. And Ray Wimwood says, you see these books, I couldn't remember all the books. He's got Should America Pay? That's the book I was stumbling on. He's got Belinda's petition. That was the first person that got reparations. Am I right, Ray?
Right.
Black enslaved woman sued for her in Massachusetts for pay for her work for nothing for this person, and won. And so then we have many people here. The what's it called? Ray, I have both books.
With the warrior method.
Right. No, not the, and then our sister here,
Frances Cress Wells.
Cress Welsing, right. So I want to wrap up by saying, because we're 1 minute over, but are there any other outstanding questions that we can take quickly, or comments that somebody wants to make that we can take quickly? Dominique and April particularly, like Teresa's on down because she's on, but she's saving her, what do you call it?
Yeah.
Internet. Anybody have any closing comment or question?
Ronnie, I just dropped my phone number in the chat. Okay.
You did?
Yeah. But yeah, we're going to talk tomorrow.
Oh, you did it to Ronnie. You did it not to the whole group.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody?
This has been good. I learned a lot.
I put in a question in the chat because I felt like in one of the things that I saw in Nkechi talked about an eligibility criteria that she wrote about in her book.
Which is?
I feel like, and I'm not sure, so I don't want to misspeak, but I feel like it has something to do with like timing around when somebody is here, like when somebody came to the country, maybe something to do with the census, something to do. I don't know if you're even aware of what she said, but I was just wondering if anybody is aware of what she said and what your position is on it.
I was
I'm
on the program, but I can't remember.
And I'm not aware of what she said either, but you saying that made me remember another argument or another comment that I wanted to make, that like basically this argument comes from the perspective of that we have one pot and it's limited, and there's not enough resources to go around. And I think Professor Wimbush said earlier, like when the pandemic came, the government found stimulus money like that. And I also think it pits us against each other, which is like another argument that earlier, like, oh my God, these people are coming to the States and they're taking all these resources. But in reality, the powers that be were never intended to, they were never intended for us to see true economic liberation.
Absolutely, April.
One of the arguments, and I don't know if it was, I know it was an argument made by, I don't remember it being made by Nkichi, but that it should start from I think Black folk who were here in 1800 or something like that. It has a year. And I think those are things to talk through. But I do think that, as Cobra has argued when we created the 5 injury areas and all that, and I think, and Ray is totally correct, we didn't argue about lineage. You know, when Diallo was killed, our response was, well, they didn't ask, they didn't stop and say, well, before we kill you and shoot you 41 times, are you a descendant of an enslaved African? No, his skin color, that's the anti-blackness piece that Lisa Holder talks about in the eligibility tape. So I want to thank everyone for their participation in this discussion. There's more to be said, more to be analyzed, more to be discussed. I would really urge us, as I said earlier, to really hit head on the arguments for various restrictions in terms of reparations, and really use our brain power and our energy and our commitment to justice to be able to say, but is that really fair? Is that really the reality of what happened in the United States? How can you close the wealth gap, which is the big thing that when I listened to that tape, Teresa sent it to me earlier. I'm like, how the heck are you going to close a wealth gap and you're just going to give a check to somebody that can prove that they're a descendant of an enslaved African? Right. The last thing I want to say is that we didn't talk about it, but I think we need to think about the view that he has about the federal government funding genealogy, and you can go and Ray spoke about it. Some people wouldn't even know to do it anyway. But my view is, and it was an article I wrote in Howard Law Journal, is that the burden is on the federal government. The burden is to rebut that I'm not a descendant of an enslaved African, if that's going to be your test. Because it was because of the federal government that we can't prove it many times. So that's my little speech for the day, and it's 7 minutes after I held you all over. I'm sorry, bill me for the 7 minutes.